I do want to thank everybody for being here, uh, especially those of you who came back. That's like the biggest. Uh, that really gets me going. Those who have been here before and chose to come back. Uh, you know, you go preach somewhere on a Sunday morning. They really don't have a choice. They didn't know you were coming all the time. But then on Sunday night, if they come back to hear you, you didn't make everybody mad. So it's always good to have repeat uh, visitors. So thanks for being with us. Hopefully, in all seriousness, hopefully this will be a good use of your time. Hopefully you pick something up, refresh something that you've already known, maybe look at something a little bit different. But in all circumstances, in all cases, what we're trying to do with this 4 week teaching series is to, you know, really two or three things is one, to help develop a passion for the word. Uh, I can't speak enough about the role that the Bible has played in my life when I started treating it like it really was God's word, like it can be understood, like He has a message that He wants us to know. Uh, and I start living my life like that. So, one is I want to help people, I always pray, give me a passion for the word, and anywhere that I preach, that's my closing prayer. Uh, that God would give a passion and a hunger for the word down in every person's heart. Because I know that if God's done it for me, He can do it for others. And then, I've also, another reason we're doing this is to help prepare people. I found that a lot of times people go on their annual reading plan. They kick it off January after New Year, part of their New Year's resolution, or just, even if they do stick with it, they, a lot of people, since we're on the Western calendar, we like to time everything up with the beginning of the calendar year. So for those who are going on a 1 year reading plan, I thought take the month of December, help lead up to it so that we can have a better than ever result out of reading our Bible. And just one other note on that, I think that we get so. I'll keep it for me. I don't know about you. I think there's been such an emphasis, either caught or taught, either implicit or explicit in my past, that we got to really set a time, a quiet time. I don't know where that word or that term came from, but we've got to get our coffee and our highlighter and our pen and our notebook and our journal and our Bible, and we've got to set a time. This like whole big thing where we're supposed to have this, really spiritual moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. Please don't take away that I'm saying that there's something wrong with that. What I'm saying is that that's good. And it's also good to not have that expectation every time we read the Bible. I think that the Bible is important to be read, not necessarily for any kind of spiritual, hear what I'm saying, not necessarily for a spiritual impartation or revelation or anything, but just reading it for knowledge. I think there's a very powerful usefulness just in knowing the stories of the Bible, the content, the names, the places, even some of the dates. I think there's powerful in a head knowledge of the word. You know, I don't really understand if there's a case against it. I don't understand what it would be, but I think it's important to do both. So I think that can probably alleviate some of the pressure for first time or beginner Bible readers or studiers. You don't have to always have the clouds part and this divine moment and everything. Just read the Bible. God can get you the message that He wants to get you. Read the Bible and let it talk to you. Just read it for information. And if God drops something in your heart, great. If not, then you are much better off by reading that than scrolling through your Facebook feed or through the Twitter doom scrolling or whatever that it is that we spend our time on. So let's get into tonight's lesson. I'm going to start with a little bit of a recap. Bear with me for a second while I get this on screen. I'm going to do a screen share. Uh, all right. I'm going to assume that that's working for you because it's working for me. And if it isn't working for you, then let me know. So I want to do a real quick recap. And for those of you who haven't been here the previous 2 weeks, you can find that online, YouTube, Facebook, whatever. But I'm just going to do a real brief recap real quick. In segment one, we talked about how to approach the Bible. And the short story for here is I approach the Bible like it is the literal word of God, whereas some people may approach it from an academic standpoint, where there's a ditch on both sides of the road. That whole thing that I was just saying about reading it for information. There's a ditch on both sides of the road. You can be too spiritual and you can be no spiritual. So those who like to treat Jesus as just a wise stoner hippie, whatever, whichever Jesus you happen to want to identify with, he's not just a wise philosopher. The Bible isn't just a bunch of uh, proverbs of wise sayings of how to live. It is the word of God. It is inspired by the very ruach, the breath, the spirit of God. And so, in the circles that I come from, the charismatic circles, Pentecostal, spirit filled, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of an emphasis on personal revelation. And God told me, God showed me. But, God is never going to tell us something in private that he hasn't said in his word. He's never going to say something that contradicts his word. So, that was a very big realization. It seems very basic, right? It seems very obvious, but it was a very big epiphany for me, if I can use that word, that, how do you test the spirits? How do you test anything that's being spoken? Well, God's never going to contradict his word. So the Bible, we have to approach it as God's will, his blueprint, his manual, all these things are applicable. It's his will, it's his self-revelation. Then we talked about the structure of the Bible. I think that was still in week one, even though it was segment two. I think I did 2 segments in week one. The structure of the Bible, just short story. We went over how the canon was formed. The canon just means the rule, all the collection of the individual books of the Bible. What we ran or what we commonly call the Old Testament, Jesus called Bible. And we went over the Tanakh, how that stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which means law, prophets, and writing. So that's what the Hebrew Bible is. It's called the Tanakh. It's not the Old Testament. And if you've stuck around any amount of time, you've heard my rant on that. I won't redo it in full here, but just know that the old is, when we say old, it implies inferiority. It implies a lack of necessity. It's optional, and I couldn't disagree more. It's 2/3 to 3/4 of the book. Uh, we can't discount it. You can't do away. You can't understand the last section of the book, which we call the New Testament, the apostolic writings or the apostolic witness, whatever. You can't understand that properly if you don't understand the foundation that was laid. And it boggles my mind how many people, there's actually a really well-known pastor right now. He's pretty out there, and he has made his brag, not just implicitly, but explicitly, saying that we need to get away from being tethered to the Old Testament. Probably not coincidentally, this is the same pastor that's also openly embracing sinful lifestyles. So without being tethered to what we commonly call old and done away with, we can come up with any kind of meaning that we want. So then in last week, I really enjoyed talking last week, and I hope for those of you who are with me, I hope it was helpful. I hope it was provoking in some way, or thought provoking, I should say. And really, the narrative of the Bible, it's so important. If you weren't with me, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch last week. The beautiful thing about YouTube or Facebook or any of those types of streaming or services, I cannot listen to anything on 1x speed anymore. Like almost anything that I listen to is on minimum 1.25, but a lot of times, depending on how concentrated I am, I'll speed it up to 1.5 times or more. So if that's you, it works out brilliantly. You can go and in a shorter amount of time get all of the stuff that we went over last week. I really enjoy talking about the narrative because when we miss the narrative, the story, what's the meta narrative? What's the overarching story of the Bible? When we talk about that, it puts things in a framework that we can understand. So just like we can't we can't understand the entirety of a movie if we got there 30 minutes late. We can get bits and pieces. We can kind of fill in the gaps in our knowledge, but we're not going to know for certain. Same thing if you leave with 30 minutes left. You're just not going to know the story. You're just not. And so I am on a mission, I guess you can say, in my life and my ministry to exalt the entire Word of God and to push this concept that knowing the narrative, what is the story? It's not just live a good life so that when we die, we have a get out of jail free card, we can go sit on a cloud and play a harp. That is not the message of the Bible. That is not the story. The story of the Bible is it tells of God's relationship with his creation. And we discussed last week that creation is both things and people, right? So he created the cosmos, the world, the universes, plural, uh, and he created humanity. We are the pinnacle of his creation because we are made in his image. And so he created us with perfection. He created us with immortality. He created the world in a state of peace. And through sin, death entered in. Through the first man, Adam, death entered. And through the last Adam, Jesus, the second Adam, the last Adam, Yeshua, he became a life giving spirit. He is restoring immortality to the human race, just like God intended from the very beginning. So that's our hope. The hope of the resurrection is what Peter preached, it's what Paul preached, the day of judgment that's coming. He didn't, you've heard me say this a few times. I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but, and I've used these tactics myself. He didn't say, uh, if you died tonight, do you know where you would spend eternity? He didn't say those things. He didn't ask you to sign a card. He didn't ask you to. They didn't ask anybody to walk forward to the front. And again, I've done these things. I've used these things. I'm not trying to offend. It's just that is tradition that we have developed after 2,000 years of having a very Gentile Western mindset applied to these things. The message of the Bible was repent. Very simply, there's a day of judgment coming. God is going to destroy the wicked. He's going to exalt the righteous. He's going to reward the righteous. And that day of judgment is when the resurrection of the dead happens. It's when there's a lot of things that happens. But that's our hope. That's the hope that Paul said to encourage one another with. He didn't say to encourage each other with, God's going to give me a jet plane and a couple houses and all that kind of stuff. It'd be great if he does, but that's not what our hope is. They gave up all those things in order to follow Jesus. They went and sold everything they had for the field that had the hidden treasure, right? The parable that Jesus was talking about. So the narrative of the Bible, in my opinion, that clears up so much confusion and it puts things in such a clear headspace because we get so focused on, like I don't know if anybody remembers this, but a few years back, the prayer of Jabez was like all the rage. And it's just like this random thing. I don't even remember the author's name. I couldn't, may not even recognize it if you told me. It's not just taking these random isolated verses and trying to build entire doctrines or movements or brand identities or anything, when you understand the arc, the narrative arc of the Bible, it helps ground us and focus us, and it gets us focused on the forest and not just the individual trees. And that's very helpful so that we don't end up in some kind of, weirdness, really. I'll just, to be frank, so that we don't end up in weird doctrines. We don't end up majoring on the minors. We keep the main thing the main thing. So tonight, uh, we're going to get into segment 4. Uh, let me pause. Kristen told me a lot of times I get on a roll and I don't give people time to digest. Does anybody have anything to respond to any of that, uh, or anything else to say at this point?
I appreciate the overview to set us up for what you're talking about tonight.
I can barely hear you. Is that me or you? Okay. All right. Well, you muted yourself, so I'm just going to have to assume that you said what needed to be said, and you can tell me later because I didn't hear it. All right. Segment 4, we're going to talk about the language of the Bible tonight. And uh, I'll just go ahead and get to it. The written languages, yes, that's going to be a part of it, but it's not, it's like 5% of it. So when I talk about language, I'll explain what I mean here in a minute. But while we're here, the written languages of the Bible, so we're talking literally the language of the Bible. It's written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Uh, so the vast majority of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. I think it's Daniel and Ezra that's written in Aramaic because that was the language of the captivity when they were in Babylonian captivity. So that was the language spoken in Babylon, Aramaic. And so it was written in Aramaic. And then Koine Greek was the language of the New Testament. Now, one thing that's I always think is cool to notice about Greek or the Koine Greek is that the Koine Greek is the not necessarily slang, but it's the language of it's the common language. It's not classical Greek where all the philosophers and the poets wrote in. Greek culture was a big deal. The Romans admired the Greeks for their culture because they were, so advanced and sophisticated and, all that kind of stuff. So Greek culture was the thing. It was the pinnacle of sophistication, advancement, erudition, all those things. But the Bible, the New Testament wasn't written in classical Greek, the language of the educated. It was written in the language of the commoner, the Koine Greek. Not necessarily slang. There's a word for it, but I can't uh, I can't think of it right now. Ironically, talking about language, but it was written by people or by commoners for commoners so that everybody can understand it. It's not something that's unapproachable. It's not something that is only, keep the Bible chained up like they did throughout much of the Roman church history. It's not something that we are trying to keep people from. The Koine Greek, this is just my spin on it. I just find it cool, for lack of a better word, that God chose to write in the language of the commoner. So you'll see this last bullet point that I have up here, and uh, maybe it's tripping you up if you've never heard this before, but let me explain what I mean by it. So any Bible that we read that is not the literal Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, whatever it was originally written in, I have a little bit of a problem with calling it a translation because anything at some point becomes an interpretation. What do I mean by that? So even though these people that translate all these Bibles or different versions of the Bible, even though they are well meaning in most cases, they are extremely intelligent, extremely educated. They know more than I ever will. Uh, at some point, though, there are obscure verses or phrases, there are obscure words that they have to make a choice. Does it mean this thing right here, or does it mean this other thing over here? And so it's almost impossible to escape at some level, at some point, no matter how good the translation is that you're reading. At some point, uh, there is a decision that is made on how words or phrases should be interpreted, not translated. So We're going to get into this more next week, our last week, about how to study the Bible. But I just want to mention that here, we we just really need to understand that there are biases, there are preconceived notions, there are existing paradigms, worldviews, all these things that go into how a Bible translation is formed. So I think, so what's the takeaway? How do we, can we trust the Bible? Of course we can trust the Bible. In 99% of the cases, the meaning is clear, it's plain, all that. But it's also useful to dig deeper, to become really a student of the word. And here's where interlinears and dictionaries really become and concordances really become useful to look at what the real meaning of the word is. I may have some examples of this in tonight's lesson, but I definitely will next week when we talk about this specific thing about how to study the Bible. So just remember, if we're not reading the original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, then at some level we're reading an interpretation, not a translation. All right. So with the literal written language out of the way, uh, here's where I want to spend the majority of our focus tonight. And that is the figurative language of the Bible. And what do I mean by that? I believe that, every field of knowledge that there is has its own language and terminology. Sports, uh, in general, or specific sports, has its own vocabulary, right? Medicine has its own vocabulary. Law, the legal profession, politics, building, electrician, every specific genre, every specific field has terms and language that is, and vocabulary, I should say, that is unique to that specific field. This is just a off the top of my head, just really weird. Uh, this I saw a reel recently. I think I'd seen it before, but I saw this video where this young kid, maybe he's teenager, maybe early 20s, I don't know. He's recording himself trying to pull a little bit of a prank on his grandma. And so he's in the kitchen and he has an iron and he has a bowl full of uh, uh, broccoli or vegetables, whatever. And so he's like, "Hey, grandma, how long should I steam the vegetables?" And so she walks over and she is just so confused. She thinks that dude has lost his mind. Like there's just no hope for him. Whether it was staged or not, she's a great actor. I don't know, but uh, it was just really funny. So steaming something can have a very different meaning if you're a chef versus if you work in the clothing industry. So he was trying to use the steaming function of the iron to steam the vegetables. It's the same word, but depending on the context, it can have a very different meaning, right? So this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about here. Every field has its own vocabulary, its own language. Uh, I think I used this before, but there's a scene in a movie from my childhood, Angels in the Outfield, where this kid had never played baseball before. And so he hits the ball, and all the people are shouting, "Run home, run home, run home." And well, he doesn't understand what home base is. So he just takes off, runs off the field, and starts running across the block to go to his house. He runs home. And, that's another example of what I'm talking about. If you don't know the context, if you don't know the vocabulary, sometimes we can come away with completely different meanings than what the Bible really intends. Uh, yeah, that last bullet point just really sums up what I've been saying. We got to understand the language and terminology of the Bible. Uh, go through these quickly. I think I've already illustrated the point. I don't need a whole lot of examples. Living water, uh, binding and loosing. That has, well, yeah, I'm going to skip this. These are examples of I don't think I need to use these examples. I think I've already laid the foundation. I think I've already made the case. So I think that when we talk about the figurative language of the Bible, the vocabulary that it uses, the terminology, uh, I got this from my teacher, uh, and I've seen it in one other place. And when I asked him, have you read such and such book? He was like, no, I never have, never come across that. But there's more than me and another one or two that say this. Uh, I believe that there are uh, five foundational vocabularies, terminologies, mindsets. I don't know the exact appropriate word to use, but there's five foundations for how to speak the language of the Bible. The Bible is written in terms of these five categories. And if we take the time to understand these, then we can understand what we can better interpret, rightly divide the word of truth. So the first one, and we're going to talk a little bit about each of these. I'm just going to give the overview first. The first foundation that God gave to understand his plan, his word, everything is his law, or what we call law. I'm sure everybody knows by now that the Hebrew word is Torah, and a better translation of that is instruction or teaching. So he gave his law, his Torah. He gave the blueprint of the tabernacle and then later the temple. The Bible is written in the language of the priesthood. It's written in the language of sacrifices, and it's written in the language of what we call the feasts. And here's an excellent example. The feast, that word feast, this is what I'm talking about when I say that it's not exactly a translation, it's more of an interpretation at some point. That word feast, it really has little to do with eating when you study it in the Hebrew. It's an appointment. It's an appointed time. The Hebrew word is moed. The plural form of it is moedim. And so that's an excellent example of what I'm talking about. When decisions are made about how to interpret a word or translate a word, we end up with feasts. Well, yeah, there's an element of eating to these things, but it's really more accurately translated as an appointment, an appointed time. So these are the five foundations. We're going to go through these tonight. And if anybody has a question, and I'll try to notice the comments as they come in. But if you have a question or need me to pause or whatever, just let me know. Type it in the comments, raise your hand, do something, let me know. Uh, Here's another thing that I'm going to expound on more next week when we get into like hermeneutics and how to study and how to make it all harmonized and all that kind of stuff. But I believe that there are four levels of interpretation. This is a rabbinical understanding. So if this doesn't fit you, that's fine. That's cool. I'm not calling it gospel truth. I'm not calling it the Bible. I'm just saying this is a helpful method of of Bible interpretation and Bible study. It's the pardes. I don't know. Has anybody heard of this before? There's four levels of interpretation. The first level is the surface level, the pashat in Hebrew. It's a literal, direct, not necessarily simple, but it is what it is. It's the surface level meaning. There's that level of interpretation when we read the Bible. And I'll just go ahead and say right here that anything else that follows, if it takes away from this first level, this literal, direct pashat meaning, uh, then we've done a disservice to the word. We've messed up somewhere along the way. The Bible has to be true on its face. Then there comes the remez, which is a hint. It's a more hidden, a deeper, allegorical understanding. And again, I'm going to talk about this more in depth next week when we do the whole thing on how to study the Bible. But I just want to. There's a reason I'm doing it here as well tonight. Uh, then there comes the drosh. The drosh means to inquire, to search. And if you're familiar with Jewish thinking at all, then you know that the midrash comes from this word. It's to study, it's to inquire, to compare texts, to draw out meanings and principles and connections. And I'll show next week where Jesus himself actually does this. He takes two different texts and connects them in a thought together. The apostles do too. It's a very Jewish way of understanding the Bible and how to understand Scripture. And then there's the last level of interpretation, the secret, or in Hebrew sod. It's more of a deeper or mystical type of understanding. Again, we can't substitute any of these, and I think that there are a lot of people that do get into they fall into the trap of trying to look so hard for the hidden or the secret that they completely miss the surface level, right? So these are the four different levels of learning or interpretation of scripture, and we're really looking at some of that tonight. We're using this concept in how I'm laying the foundation for the figurative language of the Bible. Uh, Proverbs 25:2, you hear me quote this a lot. I really love it. It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. Okay. And this is all still just, kind of setting the stage for the five foundations themselves. It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out. God wants to be known, but he wants to be pursued. Uh, he has said, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. My purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. He has told us the end from the beginning. Like I was talking about in the meta narrative, it's no secret if you want to know. But to those who have no desire to know, God's not going to force it on anybody. Uh, Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been is what will be. There's nothing new under the sun. So Hebrews 8:5. So I'm going to use this broadly for tonight. When God gave his word, I believe that he was speaking, he was telling us to give ourselves hands-on object lessons. That's the way I always think about it. That's the way it helps me to think about Sunday school. We had angel food cake for the hands-on lesson about uh, the manna in the wilderness. It's probably, I've heard scholars or I've read stuff that say, yes, that's kind of similar, and no, that's nothing like it. But whatever. The point is that in Sunday school, we got those hands-on lessons to help us connect the dots, to experience the thing for ourselves, to understand the material, to understand the conceptual. Uh, and so I think that's the way I understand so much of what God was doing when he gave us so much of the tabernacle system, the priesthood, all of that. It was a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. And this is why I went into the four levels of learning. You can look at the surface level and see the things that God told Moses to build and the things to do, and all the 613 commandments. But I believe that there's a deeper uh, interpretation. Maybe some would disagree with me, but I think they're wrong. I think there is a deeper meaning, a hidden meaning in the things that God has revealed. How about this one? Psalm 25:14. The secret of the Lord is for those who fear him. The secret counsel of the Lord is for those who fear him. I do believe. I really do. And I'm in a area of study these days. I'm I'm listening to some people and reading some material that's a little bit different. So I guess maybe I have this undercurrent in my mind of people who are not as sympathetic to the deeper mystical interpretations. So I guess in my mind, I keep feeling the need to argue my case or defend my case. But I assume just from the names that I do see on here, most of us are coming from the same or similar background, and we have no problem accepting this. But just whether you do or not, I do believe, let me just state it, I do believe that God gives us the secret things, the hidden things, if we choose to know them, to pursue them, to desire them. Just like when Jesus told his disciples, it's not given to everybody to know the meaning of the parables, but to you, it's given to God has given you the meaning. And so we can go a lot of different directions with that, but I think for now I'll just leave it there because it bolsters my argument. All right, so let's get into with all that gone. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully you see why I took the time to go through those things to establish that we can look at things in a deeper way. So let's get into the actual five foundations. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible, but not so quickly that it doesn't have its desired effect. So the law. There's a lot of talk about the law, isn't there? Uh, Psalm 1, I believe, is one of the best. It's one of my favorite passages, hands down. Maybe, perhaps my favorite passage of the entire Bible. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of the sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight shall be in the law of the Lord. And what I think is funny, a lot of preachers, because we have 1900 years of antinomianism, anti-law, anti-Judaism ingrained in our Christian DNA. So a lot of preachers, they just skip right over this word law and they turn it into the word. I'm not shooting at anybody. I just think it's funny. We turn that. I've heard so many preachers preach out of Psalm 1, but then when they get to the word law, they turn it into the word. Oh well, he's just meaning the word broadly. Yeah, just the entirety of the word. Okay, I can buy that, but you have to recognize that it is what it is. It says what it says. The law, the instruction, the Torah of God is His delight. The blessed man in Psalm 1. Uh, I've already alluded to this. You can go and look this up in the Strongs if you still have one of those. There's so many online tools at this point. But the Strong's Concordance 8451, it's the Hebrew word Torah, meaning direction or instruction. And it's derived from the same root word that means to shoot or to aim. So you've heard that sin is missing the mark. All these concepts are related. You shoot, you aim, you miss the mark, you sin. Uh, so that is what Torah is. It's God's instruction. What's next? Oh, yeah, I have it in my notes. Sin is to miss the mark. 1 John 3:4, sinning or uh, sin is the transgression of the law. It's the willful breaking of law. It is lawlessness, not recognizing God's law. 1 John 3:4 is sin is breaking the law, basically. So God gave us his instruction at Mount Sinai. There's 600, if I don't know if this is new or not to you, but I'm just going to go through it like it is. God gave us his instruction at Mount Sinai. When he spoke to Moses, he didn't just give him the 10 commandments. He didn't just give him the 10 utterances, is really a better translation. But there were 613 mitzvot or individual commandments, according to rabbinical tradition. Uh, and here's what I think that is one of the most overlooked points for those who are skewed more to the anti-law side of things in modern Christianity. Uh, you'll hear a lot of well, I've heard a lot of pushback in my life. So does that mean that you blah blah blah? Does that mean that you have to do this? And you go and kill a goat in your backyard, all that kind of stuff. What we have to understand is that not all 613 of the commandments given are applicable to everyone everywhere. So there's categories of laws that are only applicable if you're living inside the land of Israel. There are certain laws that are only applicable to the Levites. There's laws that are only applicable to women, and on it goes. So when people use this line, and I've heard a lot, and I've used it myself in the past, Jesus did not, quote unquote, do all the law for us so that we don't have to. And even if you don't add on that last phrase, the so that we don't have to part, Jesus did not, quote unquote, do all the law. It's literally impossible. How could he fulfill the laws associated with women's time of the month? Well, he's not a woman. So that's at least 612 or one out of the 613. You see what I'm saying? He wasn't a Levite. He wasn't a Cohen, a high priest descended from the line of Aaron. So it was impossible. Jesus did not do all of the law. He did what was applicable to him. He never broke the law. So here's some verses. I really like Psalms. There's a lot that goes into it, and I'm going to steal from my teacher. I mentioned him before, Pastor Joe Kears, David's father there in Houston and Huffman, Texas. Uh, he he says everybody wants to dance like David, or everybody wants to dance like David danced, but nobody wants to love what David loved. So here's some of how David felt about the law that we call, whatever we call it. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. So, I guess David, what we're going to see here in the next few slides, David never got the memo that the law was a curse. He never got the memo that it was bondage or that it was evil and that they needed a Messiah to free them from it. The understanding has always been that it's a blessing. Psalm 40, verse 7 and 8, we quote verse 7 a lot. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me. We talked about that last week, right? In connection to Jesus. But here's verse 8. I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is within my heart. Your instruction is within my heart. That's speaking of Jesus. Is he not our example? Or that's prophetically speaking of Jesus. Behold, I've come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me. I delight to do your will. Your instruction, your Torah is within my heart. Psalm 119. 119, if you haven't read it in a while, you should. It's beautiful. It's great. It's very long, but it's worth it. Psalm 119, 34 and 35. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Same chapter, verses 44 and 45. I will keep your law continually forever and ever, and I shall walk in a wide place, for I have sought your precepts. Now, what's interesting is you connect that with James 1:25. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, is he talking about a different law? I, you know, that's what that's what some interpreters say. I I personally disagree. I think Torah meant Torah. I think law at that point, I think instruction meant I think they were talking about the same thing, connecting these two. Walking in God's instruction keeps us in liberty, believe it or not. Uh, I'm not going to do a whole lesson on the law tonight, but I think it's very clear from the word. Walking in God's instruction gives us liberty. That is what liberty is. All right, what's next? 119, 165. Great peace have those who love your law, your instruction, your Torah. Nothing can make them stumble. What's next? 1 John 5, 2 and 3. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. So did Jesus give us new commandments? If so, what were they and where are they written down? And before the book of Matthew was written, or the book of Luke, and before it was finally canonized in the 4th century AD, how are people supposed to know what Jesus's commandments were? The point I'm trying to get to, hopefully, I'm not making anybody mad by that. Hopefully, you see the point that I'm making is that when they said commandments, when they said law, that was a terminology. Remember how we started out with this thing, like the example of the steam iron or sports, run home, a home run. When they said Torah, when they said law, they knew what they were talking about. When they said commandments, they were talking about the mitzvot, the instructions of God. And so when it says that that we obey his commandments, he who's the author of the book? Well, let's say that. Who is the word made flesh? Romans 8, Paul, often accused, especially in previous centuries and generations gone by, he's often accused of being an antinomian. He was accused of that in his day. We read in Acts chapter, what is it, 20, 21. Here's what he says: for the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. It's not the spiritual mind that it's the fleshly mind. The mind that is flesh is hostile to God, for it doesn't submit to God's law. How about this one? I love this. This tripped me up so hard. I was so far in one ditch when I started hearing this teaching for the first time about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more. For the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. We know that the law, the Torah, is spiritual. Remember, it's the carnal mind, the fleshly mind that can't submit to God's instruction, right? So I thought I had another slide there, but obviously tabernacle's next. But just to close up on that law thing, we have to understand that God, he wrote his word with 5 foundations. That's what we're looking at. The first one that he gave to us is his Torah, his instruction. So everything is going to be, your word is eternal. Your Torah is eternal. It's all throughout the Bible. If we want to understand it, we have to understand it from God's perspective. It's not evil. It's not a curse. It's not a lot of things that unfortunately Gentile Christianity has claimed that it is. And I'll give my same disclaimer that I gave on one of these lessons in the past week or two. I'm not trying to make anybody Jewish. I'm certainly not Jewish. All I'm trying to do is uncover the original meaning, the original understanding of the Bible. And to us, that makes us feel Jewish because Jesus was Jewish. All of his apostles were Jewish. They never signed a card saying, I hereby renounce my Judaism or whatever. They were religious Jews. They just knew that they had faith, that their Messiah had come. So, yeah. All right. Any questions? Let me see. I have a comment. Yeah, Todd, that you've also heard, I've heard it taught that this is the way the rabbis are taught to interpret the scriptures. Yeah, that I'm assuming you're in reference there, 836, to the Pardes, the 4 levels of learning. Any comments you want to come on screen? Anybody? You don't have to, of course. I'm just trying to offer that to anybody who has something. All right.
Hey, Sean,
Yes.
so my question would be, you made a comment that not all laws are applicable to all people. And in reference to what you're teaching tonight, how do I know which laws apply to me, which ones don't?
Love it. Love it. So this is one of the things that when I started learning and uncovering some of these types of concepts, it occurred to me, I'm not putting this on you, I'm saying for me, I had I had spoken ill of the law. And again, I'm not saying that this is you. I had spoken ill of the law and said all these things that I'm teaching against, really. It's from experience. And it occurred to me at some point, I've never actually read the 613. I've never actually gone through and seen what the laws are. And so there are guides, there are resources, and I'd be happy to connect with you offline, email it to you or whatever. Uh, but you can actually see what is applicable and what is not based on some of the things that I mentioned before, the categories of, like, off the top of my head, planting planting trees, two types, or the types of trees you plant, where you plant them, when you can harvest from them. Those types of things are applicable, if my memory serves correctly, to only those who are living inside the land of Israel. There are some laws that are only applicable if there is a temple standing. So we know that, that those don't apply to us. There's a lot of laws. Now, this is where it gets controversial. Uh, there are some who believe that none of the law is applicable. They're wrong. I'll just I just disagree wholeheartedly. But there are some that also, on the other side, I believe in the other ditch, that believes that there's no distinction whatsoever between Jew and Gentile. And I've flirted with that camp for a while, but it just doesn't add up, in my opinion. Where I'm at right now in my level of learning, I just don't see that you can read the Bible without a clear distinction in relation in our relationship as Gentiles to the instruction that is different from Jews. And so that right there is going to determine a lot of what is applicable to us now and what is not. Uh, so there are guides, there are resources that I can point you towards that I've used in my studies that may be helpful in that regard, just to see by category. Uh, so I'll connect with you after this if that's okay. Cool. All right. So let's move on to the tabernacle. This is the second language that God speaks to us in. All throughout the scriptures, there are allusions to this. And if we want to understand the Bible, in my opinion, then understanding the tabernacle system that God gave us, then that really goes a long way in making sense of it and not coming up with off the wall random interpretations and doctrines and ideas, and keeping it all together. So what do we start out with? Okay. So again, I'm going to use this verse, Hebrews 8:5, when talking specifically about the tabernacle. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, for when Moses was about to erect the tent is the tabernacle, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. Uh, Exodus 33, 7 through 11. I want to switch over. Give me just 1 second. Uh, Trying to put this on screen for you. Not Genesis 1:1. Let me get to the right place. Exodus 33. All right. Everybody see that? Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tents, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. So let's go back over to our notes. So the tent of meeting is what tabernacle means. It's the tent of meeting. It's where God met with man. And of course, one of my favorite things to do with this is to understand that in John 1:14, when it says the word was made flesh and dwelt with man, that word dwelt is the same word as tabernacle. Jesus tabernacled. What was the tabernacle? It was a house of skin. It took 9 months to build. It was the house of skin which the presence of the Lord dwelt in and where he met with man. Jesus was the tabernacle, the house of skin. He was the man. Christ Jesus was the man in which the fullness of deity dwelt bodily. He tabernacled among us. Uh, so if you don't know the word tabernacle, you're going to miss that whole word picture that John is trying to play from the very first chapter of his gospel. Let's move on to the third one, which is the priesthood. This is the third foundation. And, I really thought I had more on the tabernacle. Uh, there's so much that we can do with this. I guess I'm just trying to do it for time's sake. There's a lot that goes into the tabernacle. Let me just say that. And it deserves its own standalone teaching. I'm sure that at some level, at some point, you've at least come across some of it. You may even know more than I know. But the little bit that I do know, it's like so powerful and so important to understand all the furniture in the tabernacle, to understand the workings of the tabernacle. And it's word pictures, it's hands-on lessons, it's vocabulary, it's everything. God wants to communicate to us in the language of all of these five foundations, but the tabernacle is so unique. Paul uses it in his writings, and it's just another. I don't know how else to say it. It's just another example or a validation of my overall message that if you don't know the Old Testament, I'm not making it a salvation issue. That's between you and God. I'm not trying to tell you you are or aren't going to heaven. That it's beside the point. What I'm saying is that if we don't know the Old Testament, we miss so much of what the New Testament is talking about. And it becomes dangerous when we just try to ascribe our own interpretation to it, our own meaning. All right, so now let's move on to the priesthood. Uh, let's go and read that whole passage now. I've been in uh, I've read that Hebrews 8:5 a couple times. Now let's give it the full context. I'm gonna go back to my Bible app. Okay. Get there. Hebrews 8. All right. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent, true tabernacle that the Lord set up, not man. For every priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. Now, that verse can, I want to chase a rabbit right here, but it would probably take me too long. That can really trip some people up. That concept that Jesus would not be a priest on earth. Uh, but yeah, I'm just going to leave it alone. Keep going. Uh, the law is given for earth, right? It's given for man on earth. And just because Jesus is a heavenly high priest does not negate where he is and subject to the laws here on earth. Uh, you know, hopefully that's enough for now. I probably shouldn't have even drawn attention to it. I have a bad problem with squirrel. Squirrel. All right. Verse 5, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. All right, let me get back over to our notes. I'm getting quicker at this. So The descendants of Levi, the tribe of Levi, Levi was one of the 12 sons of Israel. He was, that is, that's who the priesthood was, right? The Levites, they were assigned to the duty of taking care of the tabernacle and all that went along with it. And one of the teachings that I love to do, I did it actually at Jared's church, Pastor Jared in Mahia, Texas, uh, a few weeks back or a few months ago now, is talking about how we all have a role. It's not all about us in our American dream and fulfillment and self actualization and all that. We are part of a priesthood. The priesthood functioned as a unit, as a team, and it's not all glamorous. It's not all just the spotlight type stuff. There were the priests and Levites that they were responsible for cleaning out the ashes on the altar. With all that sacrifice, it's gonna build up some ash. So who's gonna clean that? And I think there's a typology that we can use there. I think there's a message that we can take that are we working together? Are we, not necessarily the concept as we use it in our vernacular, like not know your role or stay in your lane, but there's something to that. We are together making up a priesthood. What does the priesthood do? It reconciles man to God. Everything that we do in the body of Christ should be focused on working together with the other parts of the body. We're one of many. It's not the Sean show. It's not the Kristen show. It's not the anything. It is, it is building his kingdom, not ours. It's one of the reasons why I chose to call my ministry name. I didn't want to call it, Sean Alexander Ministries. There's nothing wrong with that for people who do that. I'm just saying for me, my thought process at the time was I want it to be about something other than just one person's name, right? Excuse me for a second. So the priesthood, I think it's also interesting that that the Levites were chosen. Does anybody know? Does anybody feel like chiming in? How were the Levites chosen to be the ones that God used in the temple service? And give a couple seconds while people think of the answer. Why was the tribe of Levi chosen? How did God choose Levi, or why did God choose uh, the tribe of Levi? Not everybody all at once. Remember, we're getting into chaos now.
Because I went and killed a bunch of people who were worshiping the golden calf.
There it is. There it is. It looks like Dakota may have been about to give the answer. He was inching closer to the camera. But yeah, that's exactly right. So, that's probably, I don't know if people knew that or not, or if people commonly know it or not. It's probably a very different version than what we're used to hearing. We're taught that Christians are supposed to be pacifist, and they use that verse about turn the other cheek, and God's got a bunch of sissies working for him, and we're all just lowly little lambs and sheep and all that. But I don't see the Bible that way. I think that God calls men, and they were warriors. They were willing to stand by his side. They killed 3,000 people of the ones who led the golden calf incident. And because of their zeal and their fervor, that is how God chose them uh, to represent him in the temple service. Just a little interesting thing. David wasn't a sissy. He was a warrior. He was a mighty man. All right, get back on track. So, of within the tribe of Levi, Moses and Aaron were both from that tribe, right? So God made Aaron the high priest, and only Aaron's descendants were eligible to be the Cohen, or the plural form of that is the Kohanim, the high priest. This is why it's such a big deal in the New Testament, in the gospel accounts, where it talks about Ananias and Caiaphas, uh, when they went back and forth That's not the way the high priesthood was supposed to work. But at the time of Jesus, the temple system had become so infected by the Roman political and monetary system. Positions of power were purchased, not done biblically like what God had prescribed, like what he had commanded. It was supposed to be one man, and he served until he couldn't. It was one man at a time. They didn't trade off like that. And only the physical descendants of Aaron. So all Cohens, all high priests are Levites, but not all Levites are high priests. Does that make sense? So all Kohanim are Levites, but not all Levites are Kohanim. Obviously, Jesus in that passage in Hebrews, Jesus is our great heavenly high priest. He's after a different order. That's why it talks about him being after the order of Melchizedek. He without lineage, without in reference to who his mother or father was, because it wasn't a priesthood that was that was tied to this world, to earth. If so, like that verse says, like I pointed out a little while ago, he would have to be a Levite. But his high priesthood transcends that. The priesthood on earth is symbolic, and again, I'll use that concept of the object lesson. The priesthood on earth, the Levites, the high priest, everything. It was an object lesson of the realities in the heavenlies, in God's spiritual realities. Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that clear, but I'm not sure I know how to say it any clearer. So when you see the New Testament writers, they are using the language of Torah, of law, number one. They're using the language of tabernacle, and they're using the language of priesthood. All the Old Testament prophets did this as well. So now we come to the sacrifices, the fourth foundation. Now, a sacrifice, the Hebrew word, if you want to look it up, is korban, and it just means to draw near. That's the literal translation of it. If you look it up, if you want to see if I'm telling you the truth. One of the things that was very impactful for me is a reframe, a paradigm shift, if you will. The sacrifices weren't about appeasing a bloodthirsty, vengeful God. You know, that is a concept that comes from other religious backgrounds and other religious thoughts other than the Hebrew God of Israel. That's not what it was about. The sacrificial system was never a way to appease a bloodthirsty God. The sacrifices were a way to have communion with God. God created humanity for fellowship, for relationship, for communion. And so the sacrifices were a way to make that happen. Oh, shoot. Press the wrong button. Another thing that I think is very important, I touched on this last week. The sacrifices are not just something that can be done by anyone at any time, at any place. No, it's very clear in the word, in Torah and in other places, that you don't do it except for where God says you can do it. Second Chronicles 3:1. So I had somebody ask me, so why is it only why are you so convinced, Sean, that it's only in Jerusalem that the sacrifices can happen? Why is it only on the Temple Mount? Well, let's look at that. Second Chronicles 3:1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, or Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father at the place that David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So if you're not familiar, remember that David wanted to build the temple to God, but God said, nope, your hands are bloody with war. And so David did the next best thing. He prepared everything for Solomon to be able to do it. He got all the money, the materials, everything together. He paved the way, so to speak, for Solomon to be able to be the one to oversee the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. So Solomon built the house, is what it's talking about. Where was that? On Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. Second Chronicles 7. We fast forward a few chapters after the during the dedication. This is God speaking. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer that is made in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. So this is why we say only on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem can the sacrifices be done according to the Bible. You can do them wherever, I guess, but to be biblically uh, kosher, what's the right word that I'm looking for? But to be in line with God's teaching, His instruction, then only on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem uh, is where God has placed His name, where it's okay to do the sacrifices. Now, here's where it starts to get interesting. I'm only going to touch on this a little bit, I think, hopefully. Genesis 22:2. God said, take your son, speaking to Abraham, of course. God told Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, if you are like already predisposed to disbelieve and to oppose anything Jewish, you're probably not going to like this. And that's fine, whatever, you do you. But if you, like me, tend to view them as the ones that receive the word, the oracles of God, to what advantage then has the Jew? Much in every way. The Jewish understanding is that the Temple Mount is the place where man was created. If you've never heard that, that'll be a shock to you. That'll be a twist, and you're gonna like want to disprove it, or at least that's the way I was. And it was also the place where Isaac was to be sacrificed. See, and it was also the place where Jacob had his dream, had his vision. So God works in patterns. This is really applicable to time. Once we understand that prophecy, it's not a debate about preterism versus futurism versus historicism. Like what that means is it's not, has prophecy already been fulfilled in the year AD 70, or will it be fulfilled in the future? It's yes, both and, not either or. God works in patterns. Things repeat themselves over and over, and not just in time, but we see this in places. That place, that Temple Mount, is important. It's where God has placed His name, and that's why that is the only place where the sacrifices can take place. All right. Kristen messaged me. Did you have something?
Yeah, I've got just one comment on what was said there about man being created on that mountain.
Uh-huh.
This is something I've heard many times, not specifically about this mountain in this instance, but like, pre-flood geography.
Okay.
I don't think that there is any geography in existence today that is in the same place or is in the same way that it was before the flood.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's the only comment I had.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know where I stand on that, if I'm being completely honest. I've heard and read both cases, and not just both. There's more than two. There's more than like a both sides thing. I don't know. I tend to believe that it is in the same place post Noah's Ark. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. Uh, when I first heard that that Adam was created there, I'm like, wait, that was the Garden of Eden. But if you read, it says that He placed the man. He took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden. And so, it was eastward in Eden. And so what do we have to do when we go back to God? We go west. We enter the temple through the eastern gate, right? We go back towards God. Is that stretching it too much? Maybe, perhaps. For some, they would definitely like scoff at that. But this is what I'm talking about, the 4 levels of learning. There's the plain meaning, there's the literal meaning, but then there are the hints at the deeper, the secret things. So as long as we don't major on the minors, like I don't, yeah. All right. And there's a whole lot to this whole teaching about the Temple Mount and that whole thing. If you're interested at all, there's tons of stuff out there. It's interesting to look at. All right, are we to our last one yet? Or do I have more? I have more. The 5 sacrifices. I'm just going to go through these briefly. There's lengthy teachings on each one of these. There's layers of depth and meaning. I'm just trying to outline these. I hope, I'm pretty sure we're all on the same page at this point, but this is the 5 sacrifices. There was the burnt offering, and this was a voluntary offering. There was the meal offering. In the King James, it's called the meat offering, but it's the meal or flour offering. This one was also voluntary. The peace offering, which was a voluntary offering. And then we get into the 2 mandatory ones. There was the sin offering and the guilt offering. Now, what's interesting about the sin offering is that it had to be taken outside the camp because there is no fellowship with sin inside the camp of God. So where was Jesus taken to be sacrificed? Outside the camp, outside the walls of Jerusalem, so to outside the walls. I think one last thing I think on the sacrifices is that it's very easy to get bogged down, based on my experience and 1 or 2 others that I've talked about this with deeply throughout the years. It's really easy to get bogged down in trying to make Jesus fulfill every single, to have a fulfillment, a direct fulfillment. I'm not saying it very well. Let me get my words to go where my mind is. Jesus wasn't trying to fulfill every single sacrifice, every single nuance and everything. So if that's you, if you think that you have to find a hidden meaning, great. But I think that I don't know that that's possible. I think that the better way to look at it, what's been much more helpful for me, is to see it in its context. Jesus was not replacing the sacrificial system. Okay? The sacrificial system was a temporary placeholder that was teaching us, that was pointing towards the sacrifice that Jesus was foreordained, foredestined in the foreknowledge of God. They were a temporary placeholder to teach us about the sacrifice that Jesus was destined to make. God had a plan of salvation in his mind even before Adam fell, right? And so if you look at it from the other way around, the sacrifices were pointing future. They were pointing forward to what Jesus did or was going to do at that point. But now, on the other side of the cross, the sacrifices, they're not predictive, they're not future, they are commemorative. That's why Jesus, do this in remembrance of me. Anytime you take the Passover, now, yes, you're celebrating the Exodus from Egypt and the liberation from the slavery of Pharaoh and all that. But now there's a new meaning attached to it, an additional, a greater meaning, that we are looking backwards. Whereas for 1,500 years, they were looking forward. Every time they killed the Passover lamb, the sacrifice was an object lesson to teach us about the sacrifice that Jesus was going to make. But now the sacrifices are commemorative, pointing back to the work that he did. And so, and there's still future fulfillment as well. And I think that's in our next slide. Yeah. So didn't the sacrifices end with Jesus? I'm going to go through this briefly, running out of time tonight. So let's just keep in mind the temple still stood for 40 years after Jesus' ascension. The temple wasn't destroyed by Rome until AD 70. This means that Peter and John and all the other apostles were in the temple daily. That's historical record in the book of Acts. They were in the temple daily. What were they doing? Why were they still doing that? Why would they go to the temple if the sacrifices had ended? And so we see that Paul participated in the temple sacrificial system. When James was consulted, and he was the overseer, the bishop of Jerusalem, when he was consulted about the problems that the circumcision party had with Paul, they were saying they accused him of speaking against the law of Moses and all these things. James told Paul to go and present yourself in the temple. Well, to fulfill that vow that he had made, it requires a sacrifice. And these are just little bits of evidence. I think the burden of proof rests on those who say that the temple system is done away with, or that the sacrificial system is done away with. Because here's a big one. Not everybody knows this. I assume probably everybody here tonight does. But the sacrifices are going to resume in the millennium. So Zechariah, you can look at those references and look it up later. Zechariah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, among others, they all point to the sacrifices being offered in the millennial reign of Jesus. So it's not that Jesus did away with the sacrifices. It's that he was the object, he was the purpose of the sacrifices. So in the past, before Jesus, they were pointing forward. Now, well, the temple isn't standing, the sacrifices aren't standing, but after Jesus, the sacrifices were pointing back to Jesus. It was God's way of teaching us in an object physical demonstration about the costliness of sin, and the wages of sin is death. Talking about, a male lamb, 1 year old, the family pet, the one that's beloved, have to lose its life, right? So all these things are going on with the sacrifices. I think that's all I have. Okay, yeah. So the sacrifices are very instrumental. Paul talks about let us keep the feast, all that kind of stuff. The point I'm trying to drive home tonight, hopefully I'm not belaboring the point, but I do want to drive it home, is that the Bible is written in these languages, in these terminologies, these vocabularies. The law, the sacrifices, or tabernacle, sorry, the priesthood, the sacrifices, and now we come to the fifth one, the feasts, or the Moedim. Leviticus 23 is where we find this. The feasts of the Lord, we say the Jewish feasts, they're commonly known as the Jewish festivals, the Jewish feasts. But in Leviticus 23, it says very clearly, God is speaking, these are my feasts. And we spoke about it at the beginning, at the top of this lesson, about how feast is not a good translation. It's an appointed time. Let's go to Genesis 1:14. Everybody still with me? I'm going to pretend like you are. Or not pretend, but assume. Let's go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14.
Hey, Sean,
Yes, sir.
so we were having a sidebar here,
Okay.
the reinstatement of the sacrifices in the millennial reign.
Uh-huh.
So we had some commentary going on why that is, and we wanted to hear your take on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have a developed position on the why. I don't know that I've ever stopped and really thought through what the why is, other than what I already said, just a demonstration and a commemoration of the work that Jesus did.
One thing we talked about was, how like right now the church age is not necessarily an interruption, but there's a gap in the Jewish calendar. Talked about in the book of Daniel for sure, and other places as well. So we live in a time, an appointed time, that is outside of the nation of Israel. So, but then, of course, the tribulation period begins the final week that's talked about in Daniel,
Right.
is reinstating again, or that's when the Jewish calendar resumes. And then you have Jesus, who comes back to set up his reign on the throne of David, as a successor of David. So we're back into the Jewish kingship and theocracy. And I can't help but believe that has something to do with the reinstatements of the sacrifices, but I don't know. That was just where my mind went.
Yeah.
And Brett, so
Did I hear somebody?
Oh, yes, I think this was something I was gonna ask you afterwards, but I think I'm hearing all of this, and one of the questions that comes to my mind is like, is to be a good Christian to be a good Jew? And I think that's like gonna be an integral part of me studying the word, like from here on out, like how much, like you had Keith asked earlier, like how much of the law is applicable to me and how much is not. Even the feasts, like are we to observe them? I guess moving forward, I'm trying to understand how to look at the scripture as someone who comes from a Western culture. Does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
that's part of the reason that Keith and I and Dakota and Lena were talking about what is the significance of sacrifices post, like during the millennial reign, because that makes no sense to me. It almost seems like blasphemous. Does that make sense? So, but yes, I'm gonna mute us now because it's still a loud, huh?
No, I appreciate that. And you said a lot right there. I can relate to that. I can relate to what you're describing from personal experience. And I would be lying if I said that I had it figured out or even pretend to. Even if I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Nobody probably even knows that commercial. I don't
Sean,
know. Yes.
could I just say something just a second?
Yeah, please.
I think in study a lot of times, and having grown up studying the Levitical law, different things like that, I think one of the good things to notice, like sometimes when you're talking and dealing with people, is we have to understand when God set up his system, it was God's appointments in God's times. It wasn't appointments of the Jew. It was God. And when he said that these are statutes and ordinances that are going to be forever, I've had to have this explanation, and anybody want to feed back on this? A lot of times we use the word sacrifice, but we don't realize that they ate the animal. And back then they didn't have ways that we take care of animals the way we do now with pneumatic guns and things like that. But during these sacrifices, in layman's terms, you almost have to think during some of these sacrificial times, you have to think barbecue, because they dressed the animal a certain way and they would eat the animal, the fat and everything. And one of the hard things for me, because for the longest time I over-Jewed everything, and then I got the concept that these were feasts and appointments of God. It wasn't necessarily just for the Jew. God put an ordinance and they're the people that obeyed. But, still to this day, it's for Jew and Gentile. Now we understand we're not in the sacrificial times, but when God said ordinances forever, it was God's appointments, and it was appointments for him. And, sometimes I have lost myself a lot of times in the confusion, over Jewing everything, making it all about Jewish custom and culture. And I have to remember, it was God who appointed it. And, sometimes when you use the word sacrifice, especially even my daughter, when I'm talking to her, she's like, sacrifice. I'm like, well, baby, during this time they ate the animal. I don't know if that makes sense or helps, but on these ordinances that are forever, when does God put an end to them, and where does he start them again? We see that the sacrifices take place again. Um, we do understand and know that in the millennial, all things will be revealed, and maybe we'll have a more keen understanding then than what we do right now. Um, and sometimes I have to fall back on one of the greatest things I heard a man say. He said, "I know that I don't know. That's why it's faith." And I am one that uh, when I hear the word Jew, sometimes I kind of go, okay, well, I'm not Jewish, and I understand the grafted in and the bride and different things like that. But these divine appointments that God set, they were for Jew and the grafted in Gentiles. So I really like the question that he asked, because that is one of the things that has always baffled me, is like, okay, Lord, where does this make sense, and where does this fit in? I'm gonna shut up.
No, man, I'm really glad you jumped in with that, because that's very helpful. I hope it was I hope it was beneficial for everybody. I'm sure it was, but it was very good. Yeah, and so I think as you're talking, here's what I'm thinking, David. I'm thinking it's so important in all these subsets that I've gotten into tonight. Uh, let's it's really easy to get focused in on the weeds, right? And I use this analogy over and over, miss the forest for the trees. It's really, really tempting and easy to get so laser focused on the little things. And it's not that I'm not saying that's bad, but what we have to keep in mind is just exactly what David said, that these are God's appointments. He is the one that set it up. He's the one that set up his calendar. He's the one that set up his time, everything, everything. It's because he's trying to reveal the end from the beginning. That's what that's what this whole evening has attempted to be about. That's what I've been trying to say, that God speaks in these languages, in these terminologies, to try to reveal to us the secret things, and not just like the details, but like the timeline, the plan, the entire redemptive plan, the 7,000 years of God, all these things that we've studied. He's trying to keep us in the loop, as it were. And so I think keeping the main thing is the main thing. Uh, so I really appreciated that. Thank you for helping us out with that, David. Uh, let's go ahead and move on. I'm running a little bit over time than I had planned on tonight. Uh, I just realized now that I never put the screen share when I was reading Genesis 1:14. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." I actually am going to go ahead and do the screen share so that I can show you. Uh, so this verse that we're reading right here. So let's click on 14. And this is the software that I use. I've been using it for a long time now. So I'm old and you can't teach me new tricks. So I just like using this one. So I come up here to interlinear. And we're going to be talking about this in more detail next week. This is part of our discussion about how to study the Bible. So this is the interlinear. God said, God, let there be lights. And we come over here to this word, seasons. We click on seasons to get the definition from the Hebrew. Let's click on that. Are y'all seeing this? Hopefully. And what do you know? It's right there, moed. The same word that is later translated as feasts. God says that all the signs, that the stars, remember, Let's go back to that verse. God said, let be lights in the expanse of the heavens separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. It's the hidden things that's hidden in plain sight. If we have a heart to understand it all, God is trying to reveal his calendar, his plan, his intentions, his everything. Uh, and that's what we're studying. And we have to understand that some things we just can't understand. Like when I get into why questions, I've had to I've had to accept for myself at my point in study. I'm 41 years old now. I've been in this thing a while, haven't always lived for God, but where I am in my journey right now, there are some things that I am strategically deciding to punt on. Do you get that analogy? I'm deciding to punt to to say I'm okay with not knowing. Here's what I do know, and what I know I'm really really convinced of. And maybe later down the road in my journey, maybe when I'm 61 instead of 41, perhaps I'll have a better understanding of some of the whys. It's not that I don't need to it's not that I don't need to seek or continue inquiring, but my faith isn't in the things that I don't know. My faith is in the things that are very plainly clear. And so that's what we have to keep in mind, that God has revealed these things. And it's just up to us. Do we want to like take the time to see the depths? People think of Bible reading, people think of Bible reading and Bible study as like some chore that God's waiting to bop you on the head if you don't do it. But what we fail to recognize, in my opinion, is that it's for our own good, man. There's so much that we get out of this. There's so much. It keeps our heart, our mind pure. It keeps our thoughts focused on the hope of the resurrection. There's so much junk in the world. And I'm not just talking about sin, but there's this like the consequence of sin. There's hurt, there's pain, there's death, there's emotional, there's relational. Just this world is it's brutal, man. This life can beat you up, but keeping our head in the word of God, it has so many benefits for us. And it's not about punishing us for not doing it. It's like missed opportunities. Like, why would we not want to? Uh, we've been grafted in. We have this cultural heritage. It's not about do we have to celebrate the feast days. It's not that's I don't think that's the way God looks at it. I don't think he's looking at it as a, oh well, they forgot to eat apples and honey on Rosh Hashanah. So I I don't I don't see God like that. I see it's a cultural heritage that we have been adopted into. And so it's up to us, do we want to be part of the family? Do we want to share in these things? And for 2000 years, I keep saying 2000 years because it's a round number, but for roughly 17 to 1800 years, these things have been told in Gentile Christianity. This is historical fact. I can back this up. This isn't Sean's opinion. It was made illegal by the Roman Church, by the Roman Empire, for Christians to celebrate these things, for us to study these things. That's historical fact. Anything Jewish, it was outlawed at one point. And so that has trickled down in our theology for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we are just now reawakening. And I have a couple proposed theories. One is the reestablishment of the nation of Israel really messed up a lot of people's theology and ideology. Because, like, how can God be done with the Jews? And here we are after 2,000 years, they're reformed in the state of Israel, the promised land. But I think the more spiritual, pertinent thing is that God is awakening these questions in his people to prepare us for the age of Messiah. We're going to wrestle with these things. Paul was wrestling with all these things in his letters. How can Gentiles be grafted in, and what's the minimum they can do, and can the Jews do this? And that's the issue that Paul wrestled with, was can Gentiles be saved? And now it seems like we've come full circle, and now it's can Jews be saved? So I think that God is awakening something by people like me. I don't know how to put this where it doesn't sound terrible. What do I care about Jewishness, or what do I care about the Jews? You know what I mean? Like, what does some dude from small town Texas? Why do I have any concern or care whatsoever? I think it's because of the God of Israel that we serve. He's reawakening, and people that have no other reason to care about any of this stuff but it's a love of his word. He's preparing us for the age of Messiah. I went on a little bit of a rant there, a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's okay. I'm okay with what I just said. I think it's so important for us to understand. That's what all this is about. So we've already been through all this. Let me get back to the right screen. We're almost done, guys. Moed, Moedim is the appointed time, place, or meaning. That same word that's feasts in Leviticus 23, it's the same word as signs in Genesis 1:14. All right. I think this is my last slide that I'm going to close on. If you haven't seen this before, and this is brand new to you, let's connect offline. There are other resources that I can send you. I'm just going to do a brief overview. There are 2 rainy seasons in the land of Israel, and they are categorized as the spring and fall, right? At its most basic. And so there are feasts or appointed times that God has laid out in his calendar. While we're busy asking ourselves, do we have to? God has laid these things out for us, for our benefits, if we so choose. And so Jesus fulfilled the spring feasts at his first coming, at his first appearance. He was slain on Passover. He was buried on unleavened bread. He was resurrected on first fruits. And the outpouring of his spirits came 50 days later at the feast of what we call Pentecost or Shavuot. He fulfilled the spring feasts. And so now what we're waiting on is for the resurrection of the dead, the ingathering of the bride, the punishment of the wicked, the remaking of the heavens and the earth. And all these things are predicted when you study the fall Moedim, the fall feasts. So again, I'll say what I started with from the outset. I'm not trying to make anybody Jewish. I'm just trying to study God. I'm trying to study Jesus and the work that he's laid out for us to try to understand. Yeah, I don't know how else to say that. It's either clear or it isn't. So the Moedim, there's all kinds of teachings on this, and I would be doing all of us a disservice if I tried to go into any more depth than what I already have. Uh, I have other resources. There are plenty out there. Connect with me, Sean at e412.org. If you don't have my cell, or get with me on one of the many ways to contact me. And I'd be happy to talk more about this with you and to send you other resources on this concept. But the feast days, the Moedim, just to sum up, it's God's way of telling us his appointment calendar, his date book. We all have dates with destiny, and this is the way to understand. It's not a mystery for anybody that actually wants to know, but we have to take the time to speak the language. All of this, remember, it's about speaking the language of the Bible, the vernacular, the vocabulary, the terminology that the writers of the Bible, this was so commonplace to them. This is their life. That's why what advantage has the Jew? Much in every way, because they understand this stuff. We're the ones 2,000 years later that's like, what? They have an advantage. So speaking the language of the Bible helps us to interpret the Bible and therefore put all of it together in a way that harmonizes and makes sense so that we don't come up with whacked out off the wall ideologies. And, we see everything going on in the American church that we see because it's not tethered to the language of the Bible. All right. So how do I want to close out? Just close out with this Proverbs 25:2. I quote this all the time. It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. Psalm 25:14, the secret of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. So I'm gonna open it up real briefly for comments. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for everybody being here tonight. I really do hope this has been beneficial in one or more ways for you. Happy to connect with you offline in an extended amount of time. But if there's any questions, I want to open that up real quick before we go. Questions, concerns, anything? Yeah, me too. I'm pretty tired too. Covered a lot tonight. Whoops. All right, guys. OSE Keith coming over to the camera. You got something for me?
I just want to say thanks. I really enjoyed your class. Have enjoyed every single one of them, and keep them coming.
Appreciate it, man. That really means a lot. We're gonna have one more. That's the plan. Will be will be next week. It'll be after, obviously, after the holiday. Be next Thursday night. It shouldn't go as long as this. I'm anticipating that it'll only go about an hour. But we're gonna look at ways to study the Bible to make sure that we have proper hermeneutics, interpretive constructs, all that. Uh, and give some actual practical tips for how we do it so that, right after that, it's the new year. Everybody gets to start their annual reading plan. And hopefully, you know, I really do hope that this little 4-week thing will help some people in their 1-year journey or their renewed 1-year journey. Anybody else got anything before we go? All right, then. Thanks for being with us. We will see you next week. Talk to me. I'd love to hear from you. Hope you have a great holiday with your family. Safe travels to those of you who are traveling. Try not to gluttonize too much. Physician, heal thyself. All right. Love you all.